So welcome everybody to our podcast series, Leading in a Climate Changed World. It's a great pleasure today to be talking to Zion Lights. Zion is a TEDx speaker and author of The Ultimate Guide to Green Parenting. She has an MSc in Science Communication from UWE and is a spokesperson for Extinction Rebellion UK. She is also the founder and editor of the Extinction Rebellion newspaper, The Hourglass, and you can find her at zionlights.co.uk or www.hourglass.news. And welcome, Zion. Great to talk to you today.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So maybe we just start with, you could just tell us a little bit about the work you're doing with Extinction Rebellion and also how you see that has been evolving since its inception. And of course, because this is a leadership-based podcast, it would be interesting to hear your reflections on how the leadership has also been evolving.
Okay, so my involvement really began with actually a different team completely. This often happens with Extinction Rebellion. You just get slotted into something, and I was perfectly capable of doing it. I was attending meetings, but it wasn't sort of where my most passion or skills were. We call this in XR, we call this like the XR butterflies, people who float around before they find their space, which is important to sort of understand that in a context of because there are no leaders and there is no boss, there's no one to sort of slot you into a role. It's very much about getting in and then flying around, finding out where you belong. And then I ended up in the media team, which is where I should have been because my background is media and I'd been a magazine editor for 7 years. And we were talking a lot about how to reach outside of, the echo chamber of climate activism. We have a great podcast. We have a rebel radio station now. We have XRTV launching. So many great initiatives. We have a book. We have all the leaflets, but they are very much within the echo chamber. So the idea of the newspaper came about because of that, and was founded as a model for for reaching outside of the echo chamber, reaching people that we're not already reaching, and hard to reach individuals who maybe trust print media more than a lot of the younger generation do, and who, if you post it through their door or leave it at the workplace, are likely to actually pick it up and read it, even if they're not following us on any social media channels, or even if they don't use social media. And B, to show the world what a model of climate reporting could look like. So it's not an Extinction Rebellion activist rag, it's just not. It's, if you have a look at the content, it's news reporting and commentary on, social commentary, like any paper. We actually don't mention any party politics, so in a way it's less political than your average newspaper. There's no trying to sway you in terms of any of that. It's literally just, what could a model of climate reporting look like? And that was to show the media what it could look like, because we feel that they're struggling and they're not really giving the climate emergency the space and time and focus that it needs. So that increasingly they are, because of pressure from groups like Extinction Rebellion. But it will still be sort of, here's a one-off feature this week, or here's a segment at the back. It needs to be climate reporting like World War II war reporting. All of the paper was given over to this emergency. Even the rations, the recipe page would become about cooking with rations for your family. The commentary would all be about the crisis. That's the sort of thing we're looking at. So it's a model. Trying to lead on that, and it's been really successful actually. And we ran one cover story which was kind of like a breaking story, because it was about the number of environmental defenders who get killed around the world for doing exactly the same work that I'm doing, and actually a lot of them Indigenous people. And at the same time, there's a lot of evidence that Indigenous people are really important in terms of protecting the environment, because they caretake the land, like hectares and hectares of forest. It's really crucial to protect, and that's a UN report found that. It's not just my opinion. And that report said actually their methods are better than ours, so let them caretake the land, and in fact instead they're being murdered. So it wasn't something that people didn't know, but it was just something that wasn't really in the public. People weren't discussing it. It wasn't really in that kind of framework for discussing the issues around climate, and it's a really important part of it. So we had that as a cover story, and was really pleased that was picked up by quite a lot of other mainstream papers. And we had some of the people that we'd interviewed were then contacted, and that was really great, because it felt like not only were we trying to kind of show a model of climate reporting, we're kind of leading as well. And it's been really phenomenal. The growth of it's been phenomenal.
What sort of readership do you have? What sort of numbers do you get to?
So we print 180,000 copies a month, and that goes up every month. But there are aims to increase that, but it's yeah, I mean, there are high ambitions to increase that, 100-fold, and I need a bigger team. It might happen. And the model of distribution is quite interesting. So it's all distributed by volunteers. So what happens is every month when the paper lands, 10 or 12 distribution points around the UK take the paper in. So just people's homes, they take the paper in, and then other people come and pick it up and distribute to their areas. And you've got people going in high vis with little hourglass symbol it's stamped on their high vis and bags, and delivering them, like giving them out at train stations, at tube stations. They give out thousands of copies, and you've got people posting them through doors. I've had handwritten letters. I've had a handwritten letter from someone who had it posted through a door, a lovely old lady who just said thank you, and can you make sure I always get a copy. We've had someone from a care home say thank you for posting it, because we only get junk mail, and I think it's a great paper. So yeah, it's reaching really unusual people. I don't know exactly how many people are reading it. It also it goes to sort of bins outside of tube stations where the Evening Standard and the Metro are, and it goes to I think it's about 25 Asda stores. They
So
ship 10,000 copies.
You're funded through advertising?
No, we don't do any advertising at all. Purely through donations, through crowdfunding.
Okay.
Completely, yeah.
So it sounds like a great. I haven't yet read a copy, I have to confess. So I'm hoping that a copy will find its way even to the far-flung reaches of northern Scotland where I live. But I'll definitely look out for it when I'm next in London also. And it sounds like one of the ways that you've been working with leadership, let's say within Extinction Rebellion, it was also to allow people to kind of find their way. You talked about people being Extinction Rebellion butterflies, and then you kind of finally land somewhere. And I'm wondering if you could say a bit more about the kind of distributed leadership model, as I understand it, that XR practices, because you have kind of visible and named founders, but you also have a very distributed leadership model.
Yeah, so we work in different teams, which we call circles, and we use a self-organizing system. And actually what I've just said about the newspaper is a really good example of that, because I came into the media team, I looked at and identified what I felt was a gap that was missing, put forward a proposal and said, let's launch this newspaper, and then put a team together. And I managed that team. And although the media team will give me feedback, and they'll look at what's going on, they don't, I just manage that little team. And that's how pockets work all across all the circles. So in the media team, you'll have the couple of people who are coordinators who manage the social media team. And then there's a couple of people who manage, the press inbox, the press team, that's the press team. And that's, journalist requests and setting up interviews. There's someone who manages the spokespeople, and spokespeople training for our kind of official spokespeople, which, anyone can be a spokesperson for XR. We're very open about that, but we just provide training for some of the tougher slots. It's quite minimal training, to be honest, but it's just so that, you feel confident if you're going on television and someone might be quite heavy with you. So yes, but what I would say is the thing with all these circles is there's so many, and so I'm in the media and it's a huge circle, and there's it's all on the website if you have a look. There's so many circles branching off that, and often I don't know what half of them are doing, unless I actually have to work with one of them. And so then if you look away from that, you also have completely different circles that I'm not involved in at all. So you have the political circle, and you've got the action circle. So they plan a lot of the rebellion, they plan a lot of the actions. And they're planning the next rebellion that's coming up in the summer this year. And they work autonomously as well and independently. And again, they can put out a strategy or proposal, and I can have feedback on it, but ultimately it's their decision. So it's very much kind of, there are lots of leaders and there are no leaders, because there's nobody in every circle overseeing everything. That's probably the easiest way to describe it.
Right. I mean, I think I'm a little bit familiar with a model like that, but the question that will arise in many people's minds, I think, is, so who's coordinating all that?
Nobody.
Right. And it works. Well,
actually, all right, what I'd say is there's the self-organizing system is also a circle of individuals who try to oversee everything, but they try to make sure there's flow between groups, there aren't big gaps of roles missing, and that there isn't too much overlap, so there aren't the same circles trying to do the same things, but they're not doing anything more than that. They're trying to look at structural issues and make sure structurally it's all solid and it works, but they don't lead in any way, I would say.
So if you were to quickly assess the upsides and downsides of this as a model for an organization, what would you say? What's your experience of that?
So downsides are that, yeah, you know, you need a quick answer to something. There's not one person or a few people you can go to, and you sometimes have to go through 6 or 7 people to find out the answer, or to find out, you know, I'll go through 3 or 4 contacts. Someone give me a different contact, I ask them, they give me another contact before I find out one answer to one question from another team for something that I don't know that's happening. But it's not that they're not transparent. So often then they'll send you some kind of working document that they're working on, and everything is very transparent, and then I'll find everything out, but it's not easy. There isn't just someone to go to. But I feel like that's a really small downside for all the pluses, which is that there's so much autonomy. It's really empowering, and I found it really empowering with the newspaper, being able to draw different people in from different teams and work with them the way that we do. So, you know, we have photographers and we have artists and we have lots of different writers and interviewers and all kinds of stuff like that, and I can just, you know, I don't have to get approval from anyone. So long as I stick by the 10 principles and the principles of XR, same for everybody. It's really equal in that way. And anybody can just jump on board and get involved. And, you know, it's just really open, honest, I feel like honest way of working, which, yeah, I wouldn't change it for the world now. It'd be really hard to go back to a top-down way of working.
Yeah, and I was just wondering then whether you think it's appropriate as a model, organizational model for any other kind of organization. I mean, clearly it works a lot for a good campaigning activist organization like XR, but do you think it would work in a mainstream organization that's either a publishing company or something?
Well, actually, it seems to be taking off. So I hadn't paid too much thought to this until I got asked to speak at what was it, a British Natural History Consortium conference earlier in the summer in Bristol. And the talk that I was asked to give was in the context of old and new power. And so because of that, I read up a little bit on it and was really amazed that actually people are studying this, and it's very clear change over the last decade or so from an old, what they call old power, it's not my terminology, it's like the official terminology, which is this kind of top-down approach, to what they call new power, which is this kind of distributed model. And actually they gave some different examples, and one of the examples they gave were TED Talks. So originally it started out as you had to apply to a group, they made a top-down decision, but then the model became more, they wanted to make it fairer, so they used new power model to distribute it more evenly, so that regional groups can now set up a TEDx group and they can do their own talks, and they don't have to ask anyone. It's not hierarchy from original TED. Again, there are basic principles you abide by, but all of that content is seen as equal to the original TED model. So there's lots of different examples that I learned from them that I thought actually it was really interesting, because then the lady who spoke after me, who'd studied these models, she kind of asked the audience, well, who works with old power? And everybody put their hand up, and who works in new? And I was the only one. And then she said, who would prefer, who believes that they should be in the position they're at? And I was the only one. So actually a lot of people recognized it, and that was a lot of people from traditional environmental organizations who wanted to learn, you know, how they can affect change, but are kind of in a way very limited by that structure. And I think actually that's why that structure is kind of slowly fading away, which is great.
Yeah, and I think that in the communities movement that I also know quite a bit about, we call it sociocracy. Like sociocracy has these kind of circles with linkages between circles, and I think some of the same characteristics that you're describing is becoming increasingly popular there too. So maybe we could expand the conversation now a little bit to look at, firstly, like how is it going from an XR point of view? Like, you've been in existence for a few years now. Many people on this podcast series reference you as one of the sources of hope, the kind of game changer. Many people say it's a game changer. Extinction Rebellion plus the climate strikes, you know, Greta Thunberg, all that, those are the game changing elements in the system. But I'm wondering how you see it. Are you optimistic now? Do you feel it making headway?
So I get asked this question a lot, and it's always a difficult question. We're only just over a year old, actually. So in that time, we have achieved a lot. And yes, with Fridays for Future, helped to change the dialogue and helped to get climate crisis on the agenda. And I was doing this for a long time in my work before, and was very much felt alone in it, and I wasn't getting anywhere. So this, for me, has been really phenomenal and incredible. But I mean, in terms of hope, you know, none of our demands have been met. And there's a lot of discussion within XR about how we can affect the change we need, which we because of the scale of the climate and ecological crisis, we just don't feel that it's enough. We don't really feel like, yeah, we're winning. And actually, you know, it's like war, isn't it? There's not really any winners. Things are getting worse. Look at what's happening in Australia. That's climate reality now. That's going to continue to happen. It's a billion species, a billion animals, you know, that we've lost through those bushfires. So it's hard actually to be optimistic or hopeful. You know, we have an immense privilege, and I think in a lot of ways duty to act here, because, like, as I say, many environmental defenders around the world are killed for doing the exact work that we're doing, and many of them are on the front lines of the crisis trying to protect, you know, actual rainforests and things. So it's, you know, I wouldn't say that I'm optimistic, and I wouldn't say that a lot of the people that I know who work in exile have a lot of hope either. I mean, it's great that it's giving other people that, and I think that's part of, it's empowering them, and it's showing them that, look, everybody, lots of us do care. There are a huge amount of us that really do care. But in terms of affecting the change that we need, you know, don't really feel that that's happening. And that's really demand number 3 is the demand for the government to set up and be led by citizens' assemblies. Don't know how much you know about this, but actually, you know, over half of UK councils have declared a climate emergency with a date ranging between 2025 and 2050 to achieve net zero emissions, and set up citizens' assemblies. And that's all from local groups, you know, local Extinction Rebellion groups, lobbying them and getting involved in that side of it. But, you know, the government hasn't really responded in any way to any of our demands. And that third demand is really important, because what I see when I look around now, what all of us are seeing is people are afraid, right? So you've got Australia's on fire, and Scott Morrison says, it's normal. This is just what happens. It's not climate change. You know, this is happening all around the world. The world leaders, in quotations, you know, they're not really leading. And actually, I think a lot of that is fear. It's a real huge crisis. It's an existential crisis, you know. And who wants to look at that in the face? It's terrifying. And the courage that I see that we're getting is from people like Greta Thunberg. It's coming from ordinary people. And that's what that third demand is about, is let's give the decision-making power for what we're going to do to save what we can and protect what we can and salvage what we can from the ruins of what we've created, you know, to ordinary people, because that's where I see the courage. And there is a lot of hope in that, because you remember that, not, you know, perhaps things haven't gone so well, but that was a minority of people, really. That's a minority of, you know, politicians and corporations that have fueled all of that, and most people aren't that. And actually, it's time to take back that power, and it's time to, and again, it comes back to the power model, doesn't it? We have to change that. It's got to go, well, I would say it has to go back to something fair, but I don't know when we last had something fair. I think it's been a slow erosion of democracy for quite a long time, and the citizens' assemblies really represent a true form of democracy. A group of people listen to experts. These would be scientists who know all about transport or energy or whatever sector it is that we need to focus on. Listen to them and make the decisions that need making, because that's, you know, ordinary people have the courage to do that, and they don't have the influence. I think even when you get politicians and leaders who really mean well, there's so many vested interests involved. They can't make the decisions even though if they want to. So actually, let's give that to ordinary people. And that's where a lot of my faith and my hope and optimism lies, definitely. I mean, I've seen ordinary people glue themselves, people who've never protested before. You know, this is why I gave up my job and just threw myself fully into Extinction Rebellion, because I saw that in people and thought, this is great. If this is bringing this out in people, it's about time we did this. Because previous movements, you know, they I mean, have achieved incredible things, but the one thing they've missed is this system change. And that's what we're really about. That's our number one thing, is system change. This system has led to a crisis that could destroy all life on this planet. It is not fit for purpose. The system has to go. The system has to change. That's really important that people realize that.
Yeah, and I love the passion with which you speak about that. Also, it speaks to my heart too. But what I'm imagining, if I was to map this system, mm-hmm. I'm trying to see where the bridges get built, because you have, let's say, citizens' assemblies, Fridays for Future, Extinction Rebellion, lots of people at that level. And I think that's also where you're experiencing a lot of what we might call leadership, like people saying, yes, we can, and galvanizing people. And then the political leadership seems to be doing something very different over here. And corporate leadership is maybe doing something else. How do we build the bridges so that all the wonderful activity that you just so passionately and eloquently described here actually has an impact on the political and corporate leadership that actually hold a lot of the levers of power as constituted at the moment.
But we've been doing that for a long time. I mean, I've been in climate activism for a long time. I was in Camp for Climate Action 10 years ago, trying to affect that change. And I don't think that it's going to, I mean, you know, we have an entire circle called citizen assemblies, and we have a political circle. So they know more about this than me, and they work more in these areas than me. So just giving my kind of view on it, my take on it is that those people held up by those systems have failed us. They have allowed us to sleepwalk into this crisis, you know, which could end all life on the planet. It's got to go. They've all got to go. And I've said this directly to people that I've met. I met some really big, you know, CEOs, people who work quite high up in some banks and things like that. And they've said, look, you know, yeah, you know, we'll join you. And I said, we're not asking you to join us. We're not trying to convert anyone to a cause. That's not what it's about. We want you to either have the courage to make the decisions that need making now, today, to bring down emissions, to bring down global temperatures, or step out of the way and allow ordinary people who have the courage to do it.
Right. And my question, right, I get that. My question really is, who is listening? Like,
well, I mean, so there are a lot of.
Do you have examples of people where you feel like, yeah, you've made that kind of direct?
Sure. So there's a lot of politicians who are on side, I would say, and but again, but that's what I'm trying to say, that you know, it's one thing to say you're on side and you support it, but what's the action? And is it on the scale of the emergency? And actually, there's hardly any of that. And so we have massive celebrities, politicians, you know, endorsing us and giving us money and coming in and being in our videos and all of that. But what are they putting on the line? Because, you know, a lot of us, we're putting our liberty on the line doing these actions, closing roads and climbing on tube. You know, we don't want to have to do that. But it's putting it on the agenda. And that's the only thing that has been able to put it on the agenda in a decade of climate activism. These are the first things that have worked. So actually, I wouldn't say there is really anyone who's come forward from the existing power models who really grasps the situation to a degree where they're going to take the action that needs to be taken.
Right. That's very sobering, though, because, you know, earlier I interviewed Jonathan Porritt, and he basically said the same. I said, where on the planet do you feel there is the political leadership that we need at this time around climate emergency? He said, nowhere. I said, where on the planet do you see the corporate leadership that we need? He said, nowhere. You're basically saying the same.
I mean, yeah. And, you know, and also the other thing I'd say is that 10 years ago, they were pretending that they were making these changes, because I listened, you know, and I saw, all right, they've got these targets, which we set our own, you know, emissions targets, which actually we're on track to miss. You know, and all of that, I think a lot of us heard that and thought, great, we've got this crisis in hand. I had children thinking we had it in hand. And what happened is, talk about sobering, the IPCC report came out, the 1.5 warming report. And it was actually that galvanized both Extinction Rebellion and Greta, seeing that and saying, what is the point in going to school and sitting on our own outside school? Because that report showed actually not just how little we'd done, but how much worse things had gotten. I mean, I cried reading that report. I couldn't believe it. And it's not, you know, an opinion piece. It's just data. It just says, here's where we are. Here's what we need to do. And you look at it and you just think, we are nowhere on track to do any of these things. And if we don't do it, here are some of the things that will happen. And they're horrendous, terrifying things. And that's just talking about keeping below 1.5 degree. And we're on a trajectory for, you know, 3 to 4 degrees. I mean, yeah, there's been no leadership. There's only been lip service and pretense. And that's another danger with this our government's 2050 target, is it's leaving it to future governments, really, isn't it? It's not, if we had an earlier target, they'd have to show now, what are you putting in place right now to make sure we bring those emissions down? And actually, I saw a report that said at the moment, they're not even on track to meet a 2050 target because they're not making those changes. It's all lip service.
So what might make a difference to that?
Just constant pressure. I mean, this is what we're doing, is constant pressure and trying to redistribute the power so that it comes down to people. So for example, this, you know, the council's thing is really positive, and not just the council, but many organizations who've declared their own, you know, climate emergency. So I just saw today a press release came out through to my inbox that the National Trust has declared, and they've set a net zero emissions by 2030. So actually, if a lot of businesses and organizations and councils are doing it anyway, then it almost doesn't matter what the government is setting as their target. You know, almost, I say almost though, because of course they're giving out lots of money in fossil fuel subsidies and things that we can't influence. And that's where the problem is in the distribution of power. But we certainly, as a society, I would say, people are very sharp to it, and they're really making the changes, looking at how their businesses can get those emissions down. Again, we're kind of leading the way, and it takes real courage, and I have so much respect for everybody who's doing that. But the people who actually, give out all the money and decide, how much we're going to invest in energy and what we're going to do with the roads and the airports, unfortunately, we just have to keep, well, I would say lobbying, but I'd say, we keep doing what we're doing, keep rebelling against them, basically, and just hope that something comes of that. And maybe it won't, but, I'd hope that things like the fires in Australia and increased flooding here, things like that will really start to wake more people up, so that it gets to a point where it's a minority of people who are holding on to that power who are not acting, and they can be, step out the way, basically.
Yeah, I hear it. So your theory of change, if you like, is about a redistribution of power, that ultimately we want to put more power into the grassroots, into citizens' assemblies. More and more councils are doing that. And you've got more and more people on the streets and local communities that are getting engaged. And maybe politicians and corporate leaders will follow, but even if they don't, there's a certain amount that businesses and communities can do for themselves. That's the kind of, that's how you're working with it at the moment, with a degree of passion and urgency, but also it sounds like a degree of frustration that people are not really listening and paying a lot of lip service.
There is a lot of frustration. I still feel a lot of betrayal that they didn't act. I was learning about global warming in school. We've had so much time to act, and no one in all of that time, no one had, the courage to take steps in this direction. Let's protect. I mean, I saw a speech by Margaret Thatcher in 1987 to the UN. Have you seen that environmental speech? She was a scientist. She understood what was happening global warming. And she said everything then that we're saying now. Nothing's changed. Nothing has changed. Things got worse. And it's so damning. I mean, I don't know how these people sleep at night, really. And we have a culture of no blaming and shaming. It's very sort of, all right, we're all complicit in the system. It's very hard to be outside of that system, to live in a better way because of the way it's set up. And it's no single individual's fault. But at the same time, we do know that there's been masses of money put into climate denial that slowed change, and climate delay, which is another term people are using now, just delaying the change that needs to happen. We do know that some of the biggest corporations, the biggest polluters, knew what was happening. They knew that what they were doing to the environment, and they carried on anyway. We're not saying, stick them in prison, blah, blah, blah. All we're saying is, you did that, now step out of the way. It's time to step out of the way, because we need to try and fix everything that we can now. And there's not a lot of hope to fix a lot of it. Countless species will go extinct. We have to live with this reality now. I saw projections for where I live here in Devon by 2050 for what they think the weather will look like, what they think the flooding levels will be. And it will basically be, where I live now will be perpetually flooded. It will be underwater. I won't be able to live here anymore. That's the reality we have to live with. It's really sad and it's really horrible. But at the same time, that reality still doesn't seem to be reaching the people with the most power. And I think it's a fear thing, that it's just so much safer and easier to look away, because looking it in the face, you have to be, really strong in yourself. You have to be, Greta, saying, I have seen this is what's going to happen. Can we take action now, please? So we need that. I mean, anyone who stepped up now and decided to take leadership on that would just, come on, they'd be remembered in history. They'd leave such a legacy.
If you were to, I agree with all that. If you were to list some of the characteristics that you think leaders need now, what would you say? Like, if you had like 5 top qualities or characteristics.
5 top qualities. So courage.
Spoken about, yeah.
Also, I think compassion, because this is so we often use warlike terminology when we discuss these things. We need warriors, because it's very difficult to get away from that kind of language. But actually, the world has seen enough war, right? What we're talking about is defending. We need someone who can defend and protect. We're talking about guardians, even, what can we do to protect the last of the dying species? I mean, I saw the report that said we're going to have one in four species here going extinct. What will exist by the time my children are my age?
Yeah.
just cockroaches and rats, basically. You know, there's not going to be any, what can we do to protect now? What can we do to protect land? So yeah, so courage, compassion, also science literacy, like a really basic amount of, because at the moment there's very few people in government who are science literate, and actually that's why there's so much denial, is that they just don't understand, and they don't understand what 99% consensus of scientists means. That's a huge consensus. You know, anyone who works in science knows that actually it's really hard to get scientists to agree to that level. You know, there's often so many nuances in data, but they've done so much research now. There's no question that we're causing this, you know, so science literacy is a must. And I think forward thinking, someone who's forward thinking and can actually, which, you know, you don't tend to get that in politicians, because the system is set up in such a way that it's about short-termism, and that's not serving us. And especially with a crisis of this level, you can't think like that. You've got to think ahead. What are we going to save and protect and salvage for our future generations? What are we going to do to prevent the food riots that are coming? You know, there's already been droughts all over the world this year, flooding. I mean, you know, Jakarta in Indonesia, they had that drought that displaced tens of thousands of people. In India, there's a report that says that 40% of India won't have access to drinking water by 2030. That's really soon. You know, what's going to happen with all this mass displacement, with crops not growing? We need someone who's forward thinking, who has courage, who understands the science, and probably the fifth trait is able to listen, like listen to ordinary people, listen to experts, and just act on that. And I mean, is it so hard to ask for such a person? You know, all of humanity, what we have to offer, I think there are those people out there, and we need to make space for them, is what I think, because actually I think the way the system's set up is that it doesn't value those people. If you look at people like Bolsonaro and Trump and Johnson, they're very different personality. Well, they're very similar to each other, but very different to what I've just described. And actually that's because that system of old power perpetuates that kind of person and that kind of personality, and it's not served us well at all. And I don't think there's really anyone who disagrees with that. When I say to people this is a broken system, pretty much everybody, I mean, I don't know, maybe they wouldn't have said it before Brexit, but I think they had enough. But actually, no, actually saying that, even all around the world, you know, this last year specifically, there were a lot of uprisings of people against governments just saying we don't want this power model anymore. So actually I think at the same time quite a lot of people have been waking up to it and calling for something different, and I think we stand on the, you know, the cusp of great change, which could be really positive, and that's what we're trying to do, is trying to help to push for that change. But at the same time, it's really hard to have hope, because we know that this crisis isn't going away no matter what we do.
Brilliant. I really like the job description that you've just given us. And I have two final questions. One is, you said we need to make way for these people who have those kind of characteristics. So my first question is, do you think those qualities can be developed in people? Or is it more the people who are currently at the top need to move, and the people who are already imbued or kind of maybe born with those characteristics can grow into it? Or, I mean, it's like, can we reform, change, develop, grow the leaders who are already in positions of power to have those qualities? That's one question. And the second question is really, how do you, because I think the other thing that I would probably add into the mix to the five qualities you just enumerated would be something around emotional intelligence. And I wonder how it is also for you and for the people around you. How do you manage the intense feelings that you have so that you don't just run and burn out and collapse?
So yeah, emotional intelligence is probably, you know, quite similar to compassion, what I was meaning when I said that. So I mean, yeah, sure, I think people can learn to be more compassionate, they can learn to be more science literate, but I still think that the existing system draws toward it people who don't tend to have those qualities. Now, obviously there's a massive generalization, and there are some great MPs out there, and I've met Miliband, for example, heart of gold, brilliant, you know, like really pushing for more trees, all of the stuff that he should be doing. But let's remember when let's remember the way the media treated him, how awful it was. And I mean, look at how they treated Corbyn. You know, whatever your views are on Corbyn, no one wants to wake up and see their face on the papers every day, name calling. You know, it's a really difficult environment for anyone with the integrity, the personality that we've just described. You have to be so resilient, and you're fighting so many battles So I don't think that it will work within the existing power models, existing system. But at the same time, in terms of speaking about whether or not that person exists, I see those people all the time. I see it in ordinary people. I see it in the April Rebellion, when young people were refusing to move and the police moved in to arrest them. The older people stood in front of them and said, "It's our turn." Many of us were in tears seeing this happen. I see it in ordinary people, parents who work full-time jobs, gluing themselves to the side of a tube, or to a bus, to the campaign bus during the last election, or lying down in the road. I see young people doing it. All of those qualities I see in the people I work with every day. I'm constantly humbled and amazed by what I see in ordinary people. And actually, I think that the problem is that the system, with the current system, the drive to move into that system, and to have that power doesn't exist in those people with those personalities, is what I think. The most intelligent, compassionate people, they don't want to be, they don't believe that they should be leading anyone, which is why we want a different system where everybody has an equal voice, and there'll still be leaders in it to a degree, because there'll always be louder voices, there'll always be people who push forward with the change, but it would be fair, it would be true democracy. So hopefully answer those questions. In terms of managing burnout, so this is a big issue in Extinction Rebellion, because of course previous movements have burned out and collapsed in on themselves, and at the same time, it's such a huge battle, it's such a huge thing, it's a huge crisis to contemplate. Every day I see something in the news. I could barely look at my phone for a day after there was that image of that kangaroo, the baby kangaroo that was trying to escape the fire, and it got caught in no one looked at that and looked away, right? It was just, you did look away because it was horrific, but it was just seared into my mind, just what are we doing, what have we done, and what are we doing? And pictures of koalas running up to people and grabbing their water bottles, so thirsty, and just thinking, this is it now, this is reality. It's really hard, but I've met people, I've been on all kinds of talk shows and TV and stuff, and often get this question, aren't you just angry extremist activist? Angry? No, probably I wish I was angry. Anger would be a great nice little shield from what's happening. The word grief is what I feel. Betrayal that we didn't act, betrayal that it falls on ordinary people to lie in roadsides stopping cars just to get people to talk about the issues, because our politicians lack the guts to do it. But grief, I see a lot of that, and we have an entire circle called the regenerative culture circle, that focuses on ideas of regeneration and things like self-care, meditation, community protect. How do we protect, how do we accept loss, how do we accept grief? All of these things are kind of feeding into our messaging and into workshops for people. The same way we have nonviolent direct action workshops, part of theory of change, we need them for a regenerative theory of change. And that's really, people are really working hard on that now, and I've seen some of that coming out. And actually on the subject of grief, I've had so much grief over the years. I went to a grief counselor, and I said, I can't bear it, I can't bear the loss. And I had a real kind of good conversation with this grief counselor, where I said it was a bit like holding hands with a loved one who is dying, and that there's medicine and you could save them, and you're scrambling around and you're begging people for medicine, and nothing you do changes anything, really, is what's happening, and you're watching them slip away. And I said, how do I deal with that? And this counselor was really good. She said, actually, if they died, then you could process that and you could live with it. That's how grief works. But in the process of dying, you just have to learn to live with it every day. You just have to learn every day. And I said, but that person represents the entire natural world every day. I see. And she said, that's what you have to learn to live with. And that actually was really good for me to hear, because I was trying to put it away and not think of it, and then would just see a kangaroo picture and burst into tears. And it was not, that sort of approach will lead to burnout. So again, it took a bit of courage to really face it and say, all right, what, this much loss is real, this much death will happen, this suffering is inevitable. My parents migrated here from India. As I just said, is going to have very little access to, almost half the country will have no access to drinking water by 2030. And that's not just villages as well. That's some big cities, including Delhi. What will happen to those people? What will we be watching, happen, unfold? And it's just kind of making peace with that, not in a complacent way, not in a, oh well, there's nothing I can do, because I'm doing everything I can, but just accepting that me burning out is not an option. None of us really burning out is an option. And this, we really have this in our culture of working as well. So
Yeah.
when we have meetings and things, we make sure we check in with how we're feeling. And we, people will often say, you just said this in a chat, are you okay? Because the burnout thing is always on our minds, and is actually a huge part of the battle in a way.
Yeah, I think that's a very good note to close on, and I'm really happy that you talk about it, because I think that's what I mean by emotional intelligence. I mean, one is having the emotional feeling so that I can feel compassionate towards others and towards other beings that I want to care for, and in a way extend my circle of compassion beyond myself and my family to something bigger. But I think the other is making space for these more challenging feelings, whether they're anger, frustration, grief, loss, and it's very encouraging to hear you speak about the circles within XR that pay attention to that. And that I think it's necessary sometimes to go to a grief counselor or to make space for these. I remember talking to an African shaman not so long ago who said the one shrine that is always available in the villages in Burkina Faso, where she came from, is the grief shrine. Because if we really feel the fullness of life, there's a lot of grief. And
Yes.
particularly at this time on the planet, there's a lot of grief, and the need to kind of unload that burden of grief and to make space for it and to acknowledge it and to allow it to pass through us so that we can be kind of fit, strong, vital for the work that we need to do. That's really critical, I think. So thank you so much for your time, also for your passion.
Thank you.
It's been a very strong experience to also just feel your heart and soul in the work that you're doing, and we just wish you every success in XR. As I say, you've been name checked by many of our speakers as one of the main sources of hope and the game changer that's around now that wasn't around a year or two ago. So more power to your elbow, and we hope that the citizens' assemblies, I think, are a great avenue for deepening the democratic process and bringing the ordinary heroes, if you like, that you've also spoken about, into more prominence and more influence. So thank you so much for your time. Brilliant. And we wish you success in the future.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.